I'm Chance Dorland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. And joined now for our special Thanksgiving episode by San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger. Great to have you back, Mike. Got the holidays coming up, but the basketball does continue. We've had some interesting games as of late. Got the loss to New Orleans, but the victory against Golden State. Tell me about it.
Well, it's kind of been more of the same. And really, not just this year, but going back to last year, that these have been two different teams on the at home and on the road, and just wildly inconsistent from night to night. And I don't think it's a shock to anybody listening or anybody who's watched the Spurs recently that this is a team that can show signs of potential, that can show flashes of hope that it can be a contender, but it just is not good enough and does not have that base to be able to put it together, especially on the road on the second night of a back-to-back, which is what the New Orleans game was. That was kind of a recipe for disappointment, and that's how it turned out. If you look at, like you mentioned, the Golden State game, that was a game in which the Warriors are kind of reeling. They're as much of a mess as they have been in a long, long time because of infighting between Draymond and Kevin Durant, and then aside from that, you had Curry and Draymond Green missing that game. But what you saw at home on Sunday against the Warriors was kind of what you want to see from the Spurs the rest of the way. They played solid defense, and yeah, the Warriors were down a couple of stars, but this is still a team that has Kevin Durant, one of the two or three best players in the world, and Klay Thompson, an all-star. And the Spurs were able to handle that. You saw one of the better LaMarcus Aldridge games of the year, and just the team as a whole playing well at both ends of the court. Then you turn around, like I said, the second half of a back-to-back at New Orleans, and you just can't withstand what people don't realize is the best offensive team in the league so far this year. New Orleans, and the defense just wasn't there. The defense has not been there on the road this year, and that's going to be an issue moving forward.
So even before those two games, loss to the Clippers, but a loss to Phoenix.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of wild to look at how bad this team has been on the road for, like I said, more than a year now. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them is, for 2 decades, they had the same guys who were kind of the steadying force away from home. Things can kind of get away from you when you're not in a familiar environment. And for many years, it was Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker kind of steadying that. Another big thing is to win on the road, you've got to defend a little bit. And this team just isn't a consistent defensive team anymore. Not only with Kawhi Leonard, a former defensive player of the year, no longer on the team. But, they lost DeJounte Murray for the whole season this year, and he was an all-defensive guy last year. So not having that defensive steadiness, that defense that you can rely on the road really takes its toll. And, yeah, losing to Phoenix, losing to Sacramento, losing to the Clippers, all in a row, it really shows that they can't take anything for granted away from home. And when you look at it, the only guy that they can consistently beat on the road these days is LeBron James. They're 2-6 this year on the road. One of those wins was against the Lakers and LeBron, and they had not won on the road since last February, I think, against LeBron in Cleveland. So I guess that's the key, is to play LeBron more on the road.
And then meanwhile, LeBron, he's one of only a handful of players who had a 50-point game for how many teams? What's that statistic?
Oh, I think that's 3, huh?
Yeah, so, I think that's it.
and not many people have done that, so that's interesting.
Yeah, so he's doing well, but as you pointed out, the Spurs seem to be able to take on the Lakers. But that's a topic for a different time. But I love those games. Anybody playing the Lakers, I want to watch that. That's a fun time. Okay, so we've talked about the recent games. Let's cover a few things that you've mentioned more than a few times already in the few moments that we've been on today's episode. So this struggle, not being good on the road, it's not a consistent team, but obviously they have a lot working against them, but just they're not good on the road.
Yeah, and I mean, for years, that's how most NBA teams have been. It's you're going to have a worse record on the road than you do at home, and the Spurs are not unique in that regard. But for so long, they were kind of the outliers. They could. I mean, when you look at the rodeo road trip that happens year after year after year, when they have to go on away from home for basically the entire month of February, that was the time when typically Greg Popovich's teams would come together, would really kind of shut out the outside noise, bond, and I know I'm spewing three cliches per second right now, which is pretty ridiculous. But I mean, that's really how it worked back in the day. And now that's just not happening. It did not happen last year. You kind of thought that maybe they'd be able to put together some of that old magic whenever they went on that rodeo road trip. But the rodeo road trip last year was not good, and it's continued to not be good. And I'm not sure what the solution is to this, because I believe last year they were 14 and 27 away from the AT&T Center. Like I said, they're 2-6 this year. Again, I think defense plays a huge part of it, but a lot of it is just a team that has not been together long enough to know how to withstand the runs, and that takes a lot of time to develop.
So, big problem. Another problem, LaMarcus has had some offensive numbers that are not looking great, but you just mentioned he did have a good game against Golden State.
Well, yeah, and I think that it's kind of fascinating to look at how Greg Popovich is handling struggling LaMarcus Aldridge now that LaMarcus has been around a few years, and Pop has kind of figured out how to not push the buttons but react to a slumping LaMarcus. I think early on in his Spurs tenure, Pop was hard on him. He's hard on everybody, but LaMarcus does not always react as well to just getting beaten over the head with criticism over and over again. And when you saw a couple of really poor offensive Aldridge games in a row on that road trip against the Kings and the Clippers, where he was shooting something like 30% and held to under double-digit scoring, Pop made a point of telling our reporter Tom Orsborn in Los Angeles that he was ecstatic with the way LaMarcus was playing, that he was not struggling at all.
Yeah, I remember that. Everyone's down, but Pop is up.
Yeah, and so I think that Pop has figured out that the best way to handle those little dips is just positive reinforcement, which doesn't work with everybody and isn't the right approach with everybody, but you saw LaMarcus come back in that Golden State game and have one of his better games of the year at both ends of the floor. And really, to be fair, this has been one of Aldridge's best rebounding years. He's blocking shots like he always had. Like Popovich has said, the effort is there. If you really break down the numbers, and the offensive numbers are down, it's really just, and this sounds stupidly simple, but he's just not making the shots that he usually makes. He's taking the same shots. He's getting about the same number of attempts as he always has with the Spurs. But the reason his point totals are down is that he's shooting 41% from the floor, and that's by far the lowest number of his career. And you've got to think that there's regression to the mean, that at some point the shots that are rimming out are going to start going through the net. And if it was something like he's just not getting to the rim anymore, he's not getting the open looks that he used to have, then you might have some concern. But I think right now, if you look at it, he's taking the same types of shots. He's getting about the same number of shots that he's gotten with the Spurs in the offense. They're just not finding the bottom of the net. And I think, as many shooters will tell you, sometimes you go through periods like that. It's just been unfortunate that it's been the early part of the year where his numbers look really bad. But I think the Spurs have got to think that's going to come around at some point.
So, leading this ragtag group that's known as the San Antonio Spurs for this season, of course, the man we've just been talking about, Greg Popovich, trying to figure out what kind of team he has. If you were in his shoes, which, wow, that would be an interesting position. But what were your thoughts be about this? What kind of team do you think you have?
Well, one kind of funny note from the Golden State game the other day, and talking to Steve Kerr before that game, who played for Popovich almost 20 years ago. Actually, I think it has been 20 years ago. He noted that Pop was always best in a crisis, and in a way, Kerr was kind of alluding to his own crisis in his own locker room. But he says he takes a lot from Pop in that. And I think a lot of fans have realized over the years that Pop seems happier when everybody expects him to be miserable. And as Kerr was talking about, back in those days when they would win 5, 10, 15 games in a row, Pop was absolutely insufferable. I mean, he was miserable when everything was going well because there was nothing to work on, and he made sure that every little mistake when things were going badly, he would yell at his players, he would get on them because he wanted to keep them on edge. And conversely, whenever they'd lose a few games in a row, he'd take them all out to dinner. And I think that's kind of the situation that he's in right now. That this team is not expected to compete for a NBA championship.
Yeah, he's probably got a real nice restaurant lined up for the next team dinner.
Exactly. So, I think that you're starting to see that same approach in that he understands that there are issues facing this team, that this team is probably not going to make the NBA finals or the Western Conference finals, but he's got a challenge in front of him and he's got things to work on. And I think he relishes that in a way. Sure, he'd rather be coaching a championship contender. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but he's been around the game long enough and he's dealt with enough challenges to understand that this is something he can really sink his teeth into and figure out, how does DeMar DeRozan fit with LaMarcus Aldridge? How does he deal with a team that does not have that defensive stalwart like a Kawhi Leonard anymore? And how does he adapt to a new era of the NBA in which everybody scores 110 points a night? I think he's really excited about the ways that this team can improve. And is he frustrated about some of the losses? Sure. But it's going to be fascinating to watch how he continues to kind of figure out what kind of team this is going to be, whether or not it's going to be a playoff team or not. I don't think anybody knows, but he's pushing 70 years old and he's still got a lot on his plate. And I don't think he'd have it any other way.
Something that's interesting to me is how typical fans, or at least not us, not you and I, how typical fans are approaching what's happening now, reacting to what's happening now, getting along with the team. And so, when you come down from your giant ivory tower of being the sports writer for the Express News, wow, that's a nice title. And you talk to people at the games, or just, talking sports with whoever it might be. What are people saying? Are people, oh my God, what's going on? Are people thinking, oh, well, we knew this was going to happen? What's your average Joe or Jane thinking about the season so far?
One thing that I don't think people in San Antonio fully appreciate is that they have not seen the real NBA, like how the NBA really works in 20 years. And it's totally understandable some of the reactions that fans have this year, because spoiled is a cliche, but I mean, you've been buffered from the typical ups and downs and how every team rebuilds every few years at least. Some teams are always rebuilding. If you look at Sacramento, they've been in the lottery for more than a decade, and they have top 10 pick after top 10 pick after top 10 pick, and now they're popping champagne corks to be 9-8, and so I think it's only natural. And we're not judging fans by any means to see the overreaction to a team that is not going to win an NBA title and really has no chance to.
But is that the norm? Do you think that's your normal fan, or is that just happening enough that you're noticing?
Well, no, Spurs fans absolutely are not normal fans. How could they be? I mean, it's like asking Kim Kardashian to be a normal consumer. I mean, she just has no concept of how the real world is. And in the same way, Spurs fans have no concept of.
Wow, Spurs fans are just a bunch of Kim Kardashians. You're really blowing my mind here, man.
I mean, I could have said Bill Gates there, but it's they, and so there's a lot of, if we're not going to win the title, then just tear it all down and start over again. Well, I guess there is some merit to the idea that you want to accumulate draft picks, but like I just said, some teams that have been accumulating draft picks for a long time, the Kings, the Knicks have been bad for a long time. The Lakers were bad for 5 years and signed the best player in the world, and they're still not over the hump. So this idea that the sky is falling, so just tear it all down and start over. I understand where that's coming from, because the Spurs fans are used to, if we're not going to win a championship, then who cares? But there is a lot of teams have done well from the middle, and there's an old adage that the worst place to be in the NBA is stuck in the middle, but I don't buy that. I think a lot of teams have done okay from there, and if you look long term, if the Spurs are in the middle of the pack this year, like they were in the middle of the pack last year, there's going to be opportunities to add more players, to either through free agency or through trades, or even from the middle of the draft. They can get back to the top. And the worst place to be in the NBA is stuck on the bottom. It's not stuck in the middle. And you can ask any of the teams that I mentioned before. That's the worst place to be. And even though things don't seem great now, because this is a middle of the pack team, after 2 decades as a championship contender, things could be a heck of a lot worse. And so this is just an adjustment period for everybody. It's sports writers, it's fans, it's the players in the locker room, it's the coaching staff. It takes time to get used to how the real NBA works. And I think we're all doing that together.
Have things changed at the games, or just once again talking about the Spurs now versus maybe the first couple games of the season, where they're like, all right, a lot of fresh faces, a few familiar ones. It's a different team. Let's see what happened. Have things noticeably changed a little bit, or do you think people are still giving it a little bit of time?
Oh, I mean, this is kind of a continuation from what it was like last year. And last year there was
last year we had like the hanging Chad, like we didn't know exactly right. who the vote was going to go for. Now we know where everybody is.
Yeah. But I think that, I think back to media days before this season started, when LaMarcus mentioned when people brought up the idea of this is going to be a transition year from, the big three and the years of championships to whatever the next era is. And LaMarcus kind of pointed out that last year turned out to be the transition year. They didn't realize it at the time, because you had that specter of Kawhi and all that drama hanging over the whole thing. But that last year was when San Antonio kind of got used to the idea that things aren't going to be perfect all the time. And so that's kind of settling in now. When you talk about the atmosphere at the games, there's not, the crowds aren't as big as they used to be, and that's understandable. I mean, fans want to go out and see winners. They want to see teams that are, competing for championships, for, at the top of the standings. And obviously there's going to be a little disappointment there, but, that people still get excited about the same stuff, about big plays and dunks and big wins over the Warriors. And I think, like I said earlier, this is just a transition that we're all making. And, it's not the AT&T Center of the early 2000s, where everything was building towards the finals and the Western Conference Finals every year. That's not the case anymore, but there's still a lot to get excited about and a lot to like.
All right, looking forward. We're going to tackle a few games and call it a day. We got Memphis, Indiana, Milwaukee. What are you thinking?
Well, once again, there's an ugly road trip coming up ahead. Memphis is vastly improved. That's the one home game that you're talking about, and that could go either way. That could be one that they really need to win, because the road trip looks ugly, especially those first couple against Indiana and Milwaukee. They finished that trip with 2 more, I believe, Chicago and Minnesota, but the road's going to be a struggle, and until they figure out how to find something they can kind of rely on away from home, it could get rough. But we will just have to see how it goes and how this team evolves, and this could be a similar story for the next few months.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.